Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0, or how does Trump plan to seize Cuba? So it all started more than 70 years ago. The relationship between the US and neighboring Cuba resembles the toxic squabbles of a divorced couple. Well, as I said, it all began in 1953 with the uprising when revolutionaries led by the Castro brothers, Fidel and Raul, along with Ernesto Che Guevara, overthrew the government that was economically dependent on the United States of America. Less than 10 years later, the United States faced the large-scale consequences of the Cuban Revolution for the first time during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world is believed to have come closest to the outbreak of nuclear war. It was Cuba that played the most crucial territorial role in this crisis. At that time, anti-American sentiment was so strong on the island of freedom that leader Fidel Castro called on the Soviet Union to launch a nuclear strike against the United States to put an end to imperialism. According to the leader, the Cuban people were ready to sacrifice themselves for the sake of achieving this goal. However, a nuclear war never happened, and by 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost its powerful ideological protector. Throughout this time, relations with the United States of America remained quite tense, but never escalated into direct confrontation. Furthermore, the extensive United States naval base located at Guantanamo Bay, which also currently houses a high-security prison facility for especially dangerous criminals, continues its strategic operations in the southern region of the island territory. The situation seemed calm until January 2026, but after the successful operation to abduct Nicolas Maduro, Donald Trump turned his attention to Cuba, which, according to the Monroe Doctrine, poses an existential threat to the United States of America. So what is happening in Cuba, and why is the Caribbean crisis repeating itself again? Let's figure this out together. I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And now, let's begin our analysis of the new Caribbean crisis, or what might happen with Cuba. So let's get started. The rise in tensions between the United States and Cuba in recent weeks has reached a level that Americans and international observers are comparing to the period of the Caribbean crisis. This is evidenced not only by public statements from politicians, but also by internal signals coming directly from diplomatic institutions. At a recent meeting of staff at the U.S. Embassy in Havana, the atmosphere was described as grim and tense. According to participants of the meeting, the U.S. Chargé d'Affaires, Mike Hammer, directly told the staff, "If you haven't packed your things yet, it's worth doing so in advance." Hammer also reminded that for decades, the Cuban authorities have referred to the American economic embargo as a blockade, but he emphasized that the current situation could escalate into something much harsher. According to him, supplies could be completely halted, including oil. The U.S. State Department, when commenting on CNN's inquiry, refused to discuss the content of internal meetings, neither denying nor confirming what was said. The warnings came against the backdrop of events that became the bloodiest clash between American and Cuban forces since the end of that very Cold War. At the beginning of January, during a U.S. operation in Caracas, 32 Cuban military personnel who were guarding Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro were killed. They were intelligence officers and military personnel. In total, during the operation to detain him and deliver him to the U.S. federal court, where he was to be charged with drug trafficking, more than 100 Venezuelans and Cubans were killed. Maduro, of course, denies the accusations. The arrest of the Venezuelan leader was a serious blow to Havana. For many years, Venezuela remained Cuba's key ally and main supplier of that very oil. According to energy sector analysts, the Cuban economy depends on Venezuelan fuel supplies for more than a third of its needs. After the U.S. operation, these supplies were disrupted, which almost immediately affected daily life on the island. Power outages became more frequent across the country, and lines for gas and fuel noticeably grew longer. In many areas, electricity is off for longer than it is on. Cuban residents talk about the need to adapt to new conditions, which in a short time have become part of the everyday reality for Cubans. Against this backdrop, Donald Trump stated that, in his opinion, Cuba is ready to fall, expressing doubt about the island's ability to withstand the mounting pressure. These words were spoken in defiance of historical experience. The revolutionary system created by Fidel Castro has survived decades of sanctions, economic crises, and numerous attempts at external pressure, including covert operations during the Cold War era. For many years, oil supplies from Venezuela played a key role in sustaining Cuba's economy and economic situation, especially after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. At that time, it was Venezuelan aid, estimated at billions of dollars, that allowed the island to avoid complete economic collapse. The disruption of these supplies dealt a systemic blow to Havana, the consequences of which quickly began to manifest in the energy sector, in transportation, and of course in communications as well. According to a number of observers, the Donald Trump administration sees the current moment as an opportunity to accelerate the weakening of the Cuban leadership. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, speaking at a hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, stated directly that Washington would like to see a regime change in Havana. At the same time, he emphasized that this does not mean direct intervention, but noted that it would be beneficial for the United States if Cuba were no longer governed by an authoritarian regime. According to Politico, the White House is discussing the possibility of imposing a naval blockade on Cuba, the first since 1962, when the deployment of Soviet missiles on the island brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. The purpose of such a measure is said to be to prevent any oil supplies to Cuba. These reports have provoked a sharp reaction from Havana. Cuba's chief diplomat for United States Affairs, Carlos Fernandez de Cosio, stated that such plans are a cruel attack on a country that poses no threat to the United States and on the peaceful population of the island. Donald Trump, in turn, stated that Cuba could have avoided a complete cutoff of supplies by making a deal with the United States. He did not disclose any details, but suggested that the terms might include the return of property confiscated from Cuban émigrés after the 1959 revolution. The Cuban authorities have repeatedly stated that they are not negotiating with the Trump administration and are not considering such concessions. Meanwhile, energy experts warn about the possible consequences of further pressure. Analyst Jorge Piñón stated that if oil supplies are completely cut off, Cuba faces inevitable economic collapse. According to him, the lack of fuel would mean the shutdown of the entire economic system of the island. An additional factor was the decision made by Mexico. The country's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, announced the suspension of planned oil shipments to Cuba, emphasizing that this was a sovereign decision. She added that Mexico intends to continue showing solidarity with the island without specifying the form this support would take. Meanwhile, the consequences of the energy crisis are becoming increasingly apparent. In Havana and other cities, power outages are affecting entire neighborhoods. Traffic lights at major intersections often do not work, making it more dangerous to move around the city. In certain provinces, state radio and television stations have been forced to suspend operations due to a lack of electricity, fuel, and generators. For the people of Cuba, the energy crisis has ceased to be an abstract concept and has become a part of everyday life. Prolonged power outages mean that on most days, there is no electricity for longer than there is. Entire neighborhoods of Havana are plunged into complete darkness every night, and residents create separate group chats in messengers to exchange information about gas stations, fuel, and the possible purchase of solar panels. And, according to people who have lived on the island for many years, watching what is happening means witnessing how an already weakened economy is essentially coming to a standstill in real time. Lines at gas stations have become the very symbol of the crisis. Even in places where they accept payment in US dollars, the wait can last for several hours, and the cost of fuel exceeds the monthly income of most Cubans. At stations where they still accept pesos, the lines stretch on for weeks. A doctor named Gerardo said that he waited in line at the gas station for 29 days and isn't sure if he'll be able to get fuel next time. In the provinces, the situation is even more difficult. Many families are going back to cooking on charcoal grills, and generators are used only to preserve food. The shortage of electricity, of course, also affects communication. Unstable internet often goes out during blackouts, depriving people of the ability to work and earn a living. Photographer Dairon Blanco Ura said that during prolonged outages, he cannot send his photos to clients and is forced to wait for hours for the connection to be restored. According to him, many of his friends have already left the country, and in recent years, more than 2 million people have left Cuba. Amid everyday hardships, the Cuban government is taking a hardline stance. State media have begun actively showcasing military exercises and the preparation of citizens to repel a possible invasion. Cuban President Miguel Diaz has declared the country's readiness for a nationwide war, emphasizing the need to make the enemy consider the cost of possible aggression. At the same time, official steps have been taken by the United States. On January 30th, Donald Trump signed an executive order declaring a state of emergency regarding Cuba and announced additional tariffs against countries that directly or indirectly supply oil to the island. The document states that the Cuban government is taking actions that threaten the interests of the United States of America and is cooperating with a number of hostile states and organizations, including the Russian Federation, China, Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. The document also mentions the deployment of a Russian signals intelligence station in Cuba and the deepening of defense cooperation with the People's Republic of China. And despite the absence of an official declaration of conflict, or even more so, war, tensions are rising every day. Let's see if Cuba will be next after Venezuela. You can write your expectations in the comments under this video, and as soon as I find out and receive updates, I will, of course, let you know. So take care of yourselves. See you in the next broadcast. My name is Anastasiia Husarieva, and please wash your hands with soap. Kisses to everyone on the nose.